Don't know where it's going, but I'm recording, folks.
Yep.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. I may have messed up the recording. I've been known to do that. Hit the wrong button again. Although this is a recording, we should be okay. Welcome to the Keltner chapter meeting. We're proud and happy to have Maxwell Kates tonight to talk about expansion baseball. So welcome, Max. I appreciate your coming.
Dennis, thank you for having me, and I'd like to thank everybody else for spending their Wednesday night with us.
Well, it's cold most places that you guys are at, so you might as well be inside doing this. So I understand.
Well, it's not cold where you're at, so.
Yeah, that's right. Just some housekeeping stuff ahead of time. Just reminder, we're having our next chapter meeting will be a live meeting on Saturday, April 12th. We're going to have Mike Hopper. We're going to have the third of the SABR 50 presentations. Mike's going to do his live.
It's November 12th, by the way.
No, what did I say?
April.
Do I, I say that all the time for November, and I don't know why. Linda's caught me on that earlier today too. Whatever that next month coming up is, guys. So
Dennis,
April
you're the only accountant I've ever met who's wishing it's April 12th.
Yeah, I remember those days. No. So Mike Hopper's going to do that. Phil Sklar from the National Bobblehead Museum is going to talk to us about the museum, and then we're going to go tour the museum. And because we're touring the museum, we're going to hold this at a place called Stacked Bar over, I think it's in the 5th ward, not the 3rd ward, but it's right by the 3rd ward. It's a restaurant in the downstairs from the Bobblehead Museum. So when he's done, we just go up the back steps and we'll be in the museum. So I'm looking at trying to see if we're going to add another speaker. When the newsletter goes out in November, not April, November newsletter goes out, I'm going to ask for people to respond if they think they're going to be there. The room's kind of tight. And so having an idea on the number will just help how we set up the room. If you say you're going to go and you don't, that's not the problem, or vice versa. We're trying to get a feel for how we're going to set up the room at Stacked.
Yeah, I think the Bobblehead Museum wants us to pay all together. So I don't know if we need a head count, or or I don't know if we have to pay a head. You might want to clear that up with them.
I've asked Phil that already, and he still hasn't answered me back on it. So yeah.
Okay, because when we met with him, he had mentioned that. Then he doesn't want to take 30 admissions at once or 20.
Yeah.
So he was wondering if we could just. So you might need an RSVP from people, and that would help with Stacked.
Yeah.
Then we know.
Yeah. Well, we can also just, when they show up to collect the money, we could do it all, pay them once that way too. So
That's
yeah.
probably fine. Yeah.
Yeah. But I will also have that in the email. So, and then our December meeting says it's such a busy month, trying to find speakers and trying to find people who want to see speakers. And I'm going to be in Wisconsin in December. So we're looking at a talking baseball get together for December 10th is a tentative date at this time, just to get together someplace to talk baseball or swap lives or whatever we do when we get together. And then after Max is done, we'll do, I think most people have been on here, not everybody. We have what we call bar time at the end of our meetings. That goes back to the days when we had chapter meetings, and most of us went to the bar afterwards, and that's where we swap lies and talk baseball and all kinds of crap. So we do that after our meetings, just as an opportunity to have some of that get together without the alcohol, and it's safer driving this way. So with that, that's enough of the housekeeping for now. As I mentioned, Max is our speaker today. Max has been a SABR member since 2001. He's the only other person who I've ever seen say this. I'm working on his get to know, so I've learned things about Max. So he knew all about SABR from Dixie's play ball calendars, and the only other person I've known who did the same thing was me. And I still have them all. And so he was into that. You did a paper, and your father said you should join SABR, and you weren't sure if that made sense. And so you joined, and then his first convention was in Milwaukee. And so I'd like to say that we did a good job. We didn't scare him out of SABR. So, at least, it was a good start for him, I guess. So, thanks. Or maybe you were scared, but you just thought you had to give it a second chance, Max. I'm not sure. So, as I mentioned, I'm working on the get to know. He has done a lot of different speaking and writing, all kinds of projects that he's worked on, including a presentation on Expo's postcards in French. Please don't use French here with us today. I'm not sure anybody else on here will understand it. I struggle with English, much less. Oh, good. Well, Randy can translate for us then. Thank you, Randy. So you'll get to see some of that in the get to know. And I normally like to start out with some kind of opener type question just to get to know you. I probably know the answer to this, but nobody else does, so it's okay. But I have several questions I use, and one I really like is my time machine question. If you had an opportunity to get in a time machine, where would you want to go, or who would you want to see, and why?
Well, I'm not going to give you a specific game, but I'll certainly give you a decade and a city. And the city is New York, and the decade is the 1950s. But I would just love to see New York City baseball at that time. The New York Yankees, Brooklyn Dodgers, New York Giants. Almost all of them were at the top of the standings for most of the decade. Well, not the National League in 1957. We know who beat the Yankees that year. But it's just, that was really when, with the New York writers there, they really created a sense of baseball culture, I guess, that, I don't know, generated a lot of fan interest. And it was just a really exciting, would have been a really exciting time to be a baseball fan.
Oh, yeah. And it seemed like New York was in the World Series every year anyhow. So, I'm sure the people living there thought, when it wasn't there, they thought, what's wrong? This doesn't happen. Manley keeps coming in and out. So he must be having problems with his internet. Got it. We get that. Cool. Okay. I would like to turn it over to you, Max, to talk about time for expansion baseball. Let me share the screen. When you want me to switch screens for you, would you wave at me? I'd say throw something at me, but even your cat wouldn't be able to get through to me. So let me get this up here.
Oh, Manley's here twice. Well, let's.
You see it okay?
Yeah, I can. And with my father as my witness here, I believe the way the story went, he read an article in the Ottawa Citizen about the SABR convention the year before Milwaukee, which was West Palm Beach, and told me that I should join SABR on that premise. I had just written a term paper for university about Curt Flood, and he suggested I join SABR, so I did. And the first convention that year was, as you mentioned, Milwaukee. That was where I first met you. That was where I first met Bob Beege. It's where I first met Rick Schabowski, who I was roommates with at many SABR conventions. And the other thing I was going to share about Dennis is you talk about SABR conventions often coinciding with events outside of baseball. And in 2017, when the convention happened in New York, it was right at the beginning of July. And we both decided to extend our stay a little bit to be in New York for the 4th of July. So Dennis and I, walked over from the Grand Central Hyatt in Midtown Manhattan over to the East River in front of the UN building and watched the fireworks there.
Yeah. One of my special memories that I watched fireworks in New York with my Canadian friend and had a great time. Yeah.
So
thank you for that, Max.
You're very welcome. Thank you for joining me. And thanks to all the rest of you for joining me. Good evening on this and a very pleasant Wednesday evening, wherever you may be. Pull up a chair because it's time to say those magic words. It's time for expansion baseball.
Thank you, Vinny.
Just gonna go like this every time it's time to. All right. Here we go. So tonight I'm going to be answering a question. That question is, which of the 14 Major League Baseball expansion drafts was the most successful? And before we begin, I'm going to introduce all the teams. Okay. All right. See my finger? Anytime you see my finger, that's my signal to change the screen.
I've got to go in there and change my view on my screen. Man,
All right.
I don't know what I did. I've got I've not a screen open like this with, so I'm kind of lost on finding stuff.
All right. In the meantime, we can look at the Houston Colt 45s wearing cowboy outfits on their first road trip. And the 1960s.
Are you seeing that, Max?
Yep, that's what I said. So the first expansion draft was in 1961, the Los Angeles Angels and the Washington Senators. And then the National League expanded a year later, the Houston Colt 45s and the New York Mets. And there were a couple of name changes. The Houston Colt 45 became the Houston Astros in 1965, and the Los Angeles Angels became the California Angels in 1966. We had another round of expansion in 1969. The American League expanded to Kansas City and Seattle. The National League expanded to Montreal and San Diego. Then we had a couple of teams move in the early 70s. The Seattle Pilots moved to Milwaukee, became the Brewers. The Washington Senators moved to the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex and became the Texas Rangers. Two more American League teams, Mariners and Blue Jays, that's 1977. Two more National League teams in 1993, Colorado and Miami. And one last round of expansion teams in 1998, Arizona and Tampa Bay. Pat Gillick once remarked that he would expect it to take 10 years for an expansion team to become a contender. And Gillick oversaw the early years of two expansion teams, the Houston Colt 45s and the Toronto Blue Jays. We will be using three metrics tonight to answer that question. How well did each of the expansion teams perform in its first decade in the major leagues? That's number one. Number two, how well did the players selected in the expansion drafts contribute to their teams? And finally, number three, how effective was the statistical output of the expansion players in the first decade of each franchise? And this question will be answered using wins above replacement. We're going to be looking at players who were drafted in the expansion drafts and the players who were traded for players who were drafted in the expansion drafts, like Dante Bichette. For example, just to show you the illustration of how that works, on October 14th, 1968, the Montreal Expos selected among 30 draft picks Jesus Alou, Skip Gwynn, and Jack Billingham. Before the season, all three were traded for Rusty Staub. Alou, Billingham, and Gwynn would be considered drafted players, while Legrand Orange would be a regeneration player. Tim Foley, Ken Singleton, and Mike Jorgensen, acquired from the New York Mets in 1972 trade for Rusty Staub, are also considered to be regeneration players for the purpose of this exercise. In fact, the Rusty Staub trade continued to generate players for the Expos until 1985. My prediction when I did this exercise was that the Royals would finish first and the Blue Jays would finish second. Does anybody else have any, just unmute yourselves for a minute. Does anybody else have any idea where they think the teams are going to fall? No? All right, let's proceed. So question number one, the overall performance of a team in the first 10 years. If they finished 500, we'll give them 1 point. If they finish 550, 2 points. If they finish 600, 3 points. Now, a lot of the photos you see tonight, you will also see in the print copy of Time for Expansion Baseball, including this one of John F. Kennedy with the Washington Senators owners. The big winners here were the Arizona Diamondbacks with 12 points. They won 100 games in 1999, their second season, and 92 in 2001, plus the World Series. The Kansas City Royals were second with 11 points. They won 85 games in 1971, followed by American League West titles each year from 1976 to 1978. 3 teams scored no points. The Montreal Expos did not post a winning record until 1979. The Seattle Mariners had to wait until 1991. And Tampa Bay until 2008, but that was the year that the Rays played in the World Series. Milwaukee Brewers didn't score very well on this part of the exercise. They only had 1 winning season. That was 1978 of their first 10 years. Question number 2, for how many years did players selected in the drafts and acquired in trades contribute to their teams? 5 years is 1 point. 10 years is 2 points. The big winners here were Kansas City Royals, 53 points. Their expansion draft in 1968 generated players such as Hal McRae, Amos Otis, Fred Pautek, Marty Patton, and Kansas City native Steve Mingery. All were still with the team in 1978, and McRae remained a Royal until 1987. Toronto Blue Jays finished a close second with 50 points. Draft picks Jim Clancy and Ernie Witt contribute to their Drive of 85 pennant race, as did Rance Mulliniks and Damaso Garcia, both of whom were acquired in trades. Now, there's a bit of an inside joke with the card I selected of Damaso Garcia. It was a fire safety card, and of course, Damaso, his last year at the Blue Jays, set his uniform on fire. Houston tied for third place with the Florida Marlins with 47 points. The Tampa Bay Devil Rays finished last with 10 points, while the Arizona Diamondbacks were in 13th place with 15. Question number 3, how effective was statistical output of the expansion players? In other words, WAR, what is it good for? Unveiled by Bill James at SABR 31 in Milwaukee, July 13th, 2001. WAR is defined as the number of wins a player is responsible for beyond the replacement level at the player's position. How many wins rather, do the players present expect to produce over an average replacement at the same position? Among first-year teams, the Kansas City Royals had a WAR of 26. The Colorado Rockies had a WAR of 6. 1 WAR, 1 point. Looking at the first decade for each team, the top finisher was once again the Kansas City Royals with a WAR of 184.8. 4 Royals players, Amos Otis, Fred Pautek, Hal McRae, and Al Fitzmaurice, contribute a WAR of 89.5 between 1969 and 1978. Despite their humble beginnings as the Seattle Pilots, the Milwaukee Brewers finished second with a WAR of 151.1. As the team's general manager from 1970 to 1972, Frank Trader Lane made several blockbuster trades, which formed the makings of a contender in Milwaukee in 1978. 4 Brewers players, Don Money, George Scott, Jim Colburn, and Johnny Briggs, contributed a WAR of 73.4 in a Milwaukee uniform between 1970 and 1978. The Devil Rays fall at the low end of the spectrum again with an expansion player WAR of 36.9. The Mets weren't much better with 41.8, and finishing just ahead of them were the Houston Club with 69.4. The envelope, please.
Do you want some suspense here? I should wait a bit.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, 14th place wasn't much of a suspense. Tampa Bay Devil Rays finished last. They finished last in 9 years of their first 10, only the Blue Jays of 2004 finishing below them. They won 70 games only once in 2004, and their aggregate WAR was 36.9. 13th place, the New York Mets, 47 points. They averaged 56 wins from 1962 to 1968. Only 4 expansion players made it to the 69 Mets, and of those 4, only Tommy Agee was of any significance. The aggregate WAR was 41.8. 12th place, Seattle Mariners, 115 points. No winning seasons from 1977 to 1986. They only had 5 last place finishes compared to 9 that Tampa Bay had. Aggregate WAR of 87.6. The Mariners generated quality players from the expansion draft. Guys like Rupert Jones, Rick Honeycutt, Floyd Bannister, and Richie Zisk, but could not afford to keep them. The Mariners' fortunes changed in 1987 with the first overall draft pick in baseball. That was Ken Griffey Jr. 11th place, Arizona Diamondbacks, 116 points. They won 100 games in 1999, 92 games in the World Series in 2001, 98 games in 2002. Then they won only 51 in 2004. Most of the key players other than the 2001 Diamondbacks were signed as free agents. The expansion draft generated only 2 players, Luis Gonzalez, who was acquired in a trade for Kareem Garcia, and Kurt Schilling, who was acquired in a trade for 4 young players. Aggregate WAR 89.4. 10th place, Houston, 120 points. They only had one 500 season in 1969, and their aggregate WAR was 71.5. The Colt 45s reaped the benefit of drafting Dick Farrell and Bob Bruce, and in 1965, they acquired Mike Cuellar in a trade. Overall output of expansion players was modest after moving from Colt Stadium to the Astrodome. Ninth place, Colorado Rockies, 120 points. They struggled in their first 2 seasons and then won the wild card in 1995. Unlike the Arizona Diamondbacks, who bought a World Series title, the expansion players did contribute to the quick ascent of the Rockies. Players like Dante Bichette, Vinny Castilla, Darren Holmes, Curtis Laskanik, Steve Reed, Kevin Ritz, and Eric Young contributed a WAR of 21.2. The aggregate WAR, 87.5. Thanks for joining us, Karen. 8th place, Montreal Expos, 127 points. Aggregate WAR, 96.7. No winning seasons from 69 to 78. After going 52 and 110 in 1969, the Expos exceeded Gene Mauch's prediction of 70 and 70. The expansion draft yielded several quality players such as Rusty Staub, Carl Morton, Bill Stoneman, Ron Fairley, and Ron Hunt, and contended in 1973 despite posting a losing record. Amid a global energy crisis and political uncertainty in Quebec, the Expos began an austerity program in 1974. One rebuilding trade that hurt the Expos significantly was when they sent Ken Singleton and Mike Torres to the Baltimore Orioles for Dave McNally and Rich Coggins on December 5th, 1974. Singleton and Torres had a WAR of 48.3 from 1975 to 1984. McNally and Coggins, less than 0, negative, and they were both out of baseball by 1976. San Diego was in 7th place, aggregate WAR 89.1. They had 127 points. They finished in last place every year from 69 to 74. Nate Colbert was probably their best player with a WAR of 17.2. And their edge over the Expos was they had one winning season in 1978. Sixth place, Florida Marlins. They only had one winning season in their first 10 years. And that was 1997 when they won the World Series. They didn't contend again until 2003 when they once again won the World Series.
I'm going to stall here a little as we're going to the top five just to put suspense into it, Max.
All right.
Yeah.
What do you want me to do? The 97 Marlins featured Jeff Conine and Gary Sheffield, both players generated by the expansion draft. Sheffield was traded to the Dodgers in a blockbuster deal for Mike Piazza, who generated trades for Preston Wilson and Mike Lowell. Aggregate WAR 87.8. Los Angeles Angels, fifth place, 152 points, aggregate WAR 129.3. Nobody expected the Angels to win as many as 50 games in 1961, but they won 70, still an expansion record. A year later, they won 86. Jim Fregosi, drafted by the Red Sox, provided the Angels with WAR of 45.2 between 1961 and 1970. Dean Chance, traded from Washington, had a WAR of 20.5 from 1961 to 1966. And Fregosi was sent to the Mets in the 1971 trade, which brought Nolan Ryan to Orange County through the 1979 season. Fourth place, Toronto Blue Jays, 167 points, aggregate WAR of 116.4. From 1977 to 1980, they averaged 58 wins. From 1983 to 1993, they averaged 91 wins, 5 division titles, and 2 World Series championships. Draft picks, Jim Clancy, Garth Orge, and Ernie Witt combined for a WAR of 31.8. The draft generated players like Roy Howell and Alfredo Griffin through trades. The Blue Jays probably would have ranked higher, but for their sterling farm system and shrewd rule of 5 draft picks. Players like Paul Hodgson, Lloyd Mosby, and Willie Upshaw, seen here with Elliott Wall, who was very important with the creation of the book and unfortunately passed away shortly after the book was published. Third place, Milwaukee Brewers, 188 points. The Pilots went 68-94 in their only major league season, while the Brewers remained in the doldrums of their division until 1978, when George Bamberger imported the Oriole way from Baltimore. The Frank Layden trade to the early 70s brought several talented players to Sud City. In 1976, George Scott was traded back to Boston for Cecil Cooper, who hit .352 in 1980 and was a Brewer until 1987. Aggregate WAR of 151.1. I'm just going to, before I continue, I'm going to take a few minutes. Does anybody have this book?
Oh, yeah.
Well, this book tells a very good story of the emergence of the Milwaukee Brewers from expansion stepchildren in 1970 until they became a contender in 1978. It was interesting to read that when the Brewers came to town, Bud Selig said he wanted to model the development of the team after the Baltimore Orioles, adding that, I hope it doesn't take us 12 years to reach the World Series. And that's exactly what happened. The first World Series the Brewers played in was 1982. And it took the full 10 years, and it took modeling after the Baltimore franchise. But from 1978 to 1983, the Brewers were one of the best teams in the American League. I think the only team that would have competed with them on a regular basis was the Orioles. Second place, and this was a surprise, Washington Senators, 190 points. Like the Brewers, they only had one winning season in 10 years. They owe their high rank to the acumen of the general managers and trades. In 1961, the Senators traded Dave Sisler to the Cincinnati Reds for Claude Osteen, who provided the Senators with WAR of 9.0 from 1961 to 1964. He was then traded to the Dodgers. Wait till you see who they got. Frank Howard, Ken McMullen, Phil Ortega, Pete Rickert, and Dick Nen, generating 54.2 WAR and generating quality players for the franchise long after they'd moved to Dallas in 1971. In fact, that trade continued to generate players for the Texas Rangers until 1986. And the number one team, Kansas City, 249 points, aggregate WAR 184.8. The Royals have Ewing Kauffman to thank for their early success. Mr. K was not even a baseball fan, but rather a civic-minded billionaire who just wanted baseball to come back to Kansas City after the A's had left 2 years before that. 3 expansion teams, the Royals, the Brewers, and the Blue Jays, emerged as contenders within their first decade. Expansion has been a successful experiment as American commerce and industry have shifted from the northeast to the southwest and across the Canadian border. Major league teams have thrived from coast to coast. It was time for expansion baseball. Now, tonight's presentation would not have been possible without the input and effort of the Larry Dierker SABR chapter in Houston. That's Dierker. And when I spoke in Baltimore, Bob DeRill of the Houston chapter asked me to put together a few words and pictures about the Houston chapter. So I'll go ahead with that. We had the book launch in Houston on a snowy night, if you can believe it, in November of 2018. All of the people you see here were there. There's Jimmy Wynn, who unfortunately has since passed away, and his biographer, Bill McCurdy, who also has since passed away. McCurdy was also the editor of the Pecan Park Eagle, a baseball newsletter that was published in Houston. There's Greg Lucas, who was a broadcaster for the Astros. Bob Aspermonte, he was at the book launch, played third base. It's Mark Warnock, he's a friend of mine. Mike Acosta, who was the Astros team historian, and Mike Vance, who has written several books on the history of baseball in Houston. And who else have we got? We got Bill Brown, who was who was a broadcaster for the Astros for 30 years. There's Larry Dierker. And there's Tal Smith, who wrote the foreword to the book. He was the president of the Astros and helped build the franchise twice. Once as an expansion team, and a second time when he came back to the Astros from the Yankees in 1975. And that's all, folks.
Okay, thank you, Max.
Thank you.
I don't know about anybody else, but the top 3, I would have had one of them. Anybody, if anybody would like to say anything, ask questions, unmute yourself, please. Can I ask the first question, though?
Go ahead.
I thought it was very interesting that the Devil Rays finished last. And when you look at a franchise today, they're always talked about as being a great franchise, on a small market franchise, and how they're doing. It's how it's flip-flopped today compared to when they started.
Well, I think part of what happened is you had a change of ownership right around the time that they started to emerge. The Naimoli family had owned the team, and correct me if I get the chronology incorrect, but I think Vince Naimoli died shortly after the team came to Tampa Bay, and the family didn't want to pour that much money into it.
Yes.
They were then sold to the Sternberg family, who managed the team a whole lot better, who was able to put money in and spend money where they had to. 2008, they went to the World Series. They've since gone back to the playoffs many times since. They went back to the World Series in 2020. And even though they don't seem to be appreciated very much in their own backyard, they are indeed one of the model franchises.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else want to ask? We can unmute yourselves. And
Yeah, I would have. This is Randy. I had Kansas City first. It took me a few minutes to get the difference between the Kansas City Royals and the Kansas City Athletics straight in my mind, because Charlie O'Finley just ran them into the ground, and wanted to leave from the moment he got there, but it was the best thing, as I read recently in a book, that could have happened to Kansas City, was them getting an expansion team versus dealing with Charlie O'Finley.
Well, first of all, Stuart Symington had the best line about the Kansas City A's when they moved to Oakland, and he said that Oakland is the luckiest city since Hiroshima.
Yeah.
And Kansas City was almost born under a curse. They moved to Kansas City in 1954 when Arnold Johnson bought the team from the Mack family. Now, Arnold Johnson also owned Yankee Stadium and hadn't paid off the debts associated with the ballpark. Consequently, there was an obligation on Kansas City's part to finance the Yankees, possibly with players, to help narrow the gap. And so that's why you had so many good players getting traded from Kansas City to the Yankees in one-sided deals. I know Roger Maris may have been one of the more noteworthy players who went in that direction. Clete Boyer was another. Hector Lopez, who just passed away, was another. But that sort of cursed the Athletics as long as Arnold Johnson owned the team. And then in early 1960, Arnold Johnson passed away, and Finley was the successful bidder on the franchise from Johnson's estate.
Right.
And all Finley wanted to do was negotiate a better stadium lease than the one that he came with. He wasn't able to do that. So every few
He would have
years,
been able to stay. He wanted to stay in Kansas City. It was just the municipal stadium that was such a pit. And also the deal for concessions and the like. Or are you talking Philly still?
no, I'm talking about Kansas City.
Yeah,
But it seemed like every other year there was a rumor. First he was going to Louisville, then he was going to Dallas, then he was going to Atlanta. I don't think there was ever talk of Charlie Finley moving the A's to Milwaukee.
They used it a little. You know, I don't think we had a strong discussion, but the name was thrown out there to keep Kansas City on their toes.
As I know after the Braves left for Atlanta in 1965, the National League wanted no part of Milwaukee, but there was no reason for the American League not to go there.
Yeah.
And in fact, the Chicago White Sox, I think they played 9 games each season, 9 home games in 1968 and 1969 in Milwaukee.
11 and 69 after expansion, they had 2 more teams to play. So, yeah. Finley was just a jerk. He just, he didn't know how to play nice with anybody. So he may say he wanted to stay in Kansas City, and on the other side of his mouth, he'd be talking with somebody else. So nobody knew where he was standing. And I'm surprised the owners put up with him as long as they did.
Well, I mean, one of the examples of that was there was an altercation on an airplane when Alvin Dark owned the Kansas City, or managed the Kansas City Athletics. Finley fired him over it. He then rehired him to a 2-year extension and then fired him a second time.
Before George Steinbrenner. So, yeah.
He was George Steinbrenner before George Steinbrenner.
Yeah.
yeah.
And then in true Steinbrenner fashion, he rehired Dark after he had joined Oakland, or moved to Oakland, rather. Yeah. Anybody else? Dennis.
I'm looking at all these expansion teams and 10 years and, how their fans struggled. And I remember Milwaukee, game 1, losing 12-0. I was there, and, early 70s. Bases loaded walk was exciting because at least we were able to score a run. It was miserable baseball in many ways. And so MLB wants to add 2 teams where they can resolve Oakland and Tampa. And they're talking having ownership pay somewhere north of $2 billion for a team. Who's going to want to pay $2 billion to wander around in last place for 10 years?
First of all, I think Major League Baseball is asinine if they're even considering the idea of expanding to 2 more teams. Major League Baseball has at least 4 or 5 sick franchises. Get those dealt with before you start adding teams. I mean, I think the game's watered down as it is. We know they're not going to take away any teams because they tried that once. They never actually said which teams it was, but it was pretty well accepted that the Twins and the Expos were the 2 teams that were on the cutting block in 2001.
Thank God we had a new ballpark in Milwaukee. We would have been on that list.
Could be.
Yeah.
But if Major League Baseball is talking about expanding to 2 more teams, they're only looking after their own financial interest. If you're talking about $2 billion as a franchise fee, I can't see anyone in their right mind paying that. Then again, I think it's Frank Foley was the name of the owner in Vegas who bought the Vegas Golden Knights in the NHL, and they've been a winning franchise. They went all the way to the Stanley Cup in their first season.
Takes a Canadian to let us know that one.
But no, I think expanding is the wrong business model for right now. I mean, I don't know how they're going to deal with Oakland. I don't know how they're going to deal with Tampa. Baltimore's another one. I mean, they've got uncertain ownership, and their stadium lease is up next year. Who would have thought the model franchise of baseball, really not that long ago, is in questionable terms right now?
Where are they going to go?
The word on the street is Nashville. Dan Duquette is trying to bring a team to Nashville. And I think Dave Stewart is one of the people behind it.
Yeah, Dave Stewart's involved. They want to name them the Nashville Stars after the Negro League team and honor them with the name. And so, yeah.
Well, I've got a different name that I was going to suggest. If you remember the Love and Spoonful song, call them the Nashville Cats because it sounds like my name.
Yeah. So that was after you, Max. I always thought it was a different kind of song. I never knew that. So yeah. Yeah.
See, I had the 2 expansion teams as Charlotte and Las Vegas, not Nashville. But I could see Nashville just as easily as Charlotte.
Well, if you're talking about
Nashville,
cities, if you're talking about cities that don't have major league teams that would support major league teams, Vegas probably could. Whether Major League Baseball wants to go to Nevada because of the gambling issue is a different story. Mind you, the NFL is in Las Vegas and the NHL is in Las Vegas. Charlotte and Raleigh are 2 cities that have been discussed every now and again. I mean, they both have a population large enough that could support a major league team. Raleigh does have an NHL team. They have the Carolina Hurricanes, and they draw very well. There was a study done right after the Expos moved to Washington about what team would best support, or rather, what city would best support a team. And does anyone know what the answer was?
Montreal?
Nope.
Oh,
No.
New York.
A 3rd team in New York, correct.
Yep.
But that's never going to
Got
happen
the
either because the
population
Yankees and Mets
for
are going to demand a massive indemnity fee.
And attendance is down throughout baseball. I mean, I think I read that it's the worst attendance figure since in 25 years. It's
This
going to
year?
just trend downward.
This year, Mary?
Yeah, I could see it with the
Wow.
Brewers when like Bob, and you go to the ballpark. You could tell the attendance was down. I don't know if it's because of COVID or I don't know. I don't know what it is.
I think sorry.
Well,
Sure, go
Saturday
ahead.
night games used to sell out, and like they get good crowds, 36,000, which is great, but they used to sell out. Yeah.
Well, I think like any problems in Major League Baseball, there isn't any simple answers.
Mhm.
COVID is definitely a factor. The economy is another factor. The price of gas for many families price themselves out of driving great distances, let alone purchasing ticket prices. Ticket prices are too high. I mean, you look around Major League Baseball, who are the people that you see at games? You don't see a lot of families with young kids. You don't see a lot of grandparents. It's generally the corporate crowd that comes out.
Baseball is cheaper than basketball. Here in Phoenix area, the newspaper had the average price to go to an NBA game, family of 4, 2 beers, 2 sodas, 4 hot dogs, $288. Yeah, here in Phoenix, it's $323. So they're above the average. Milwaukee's just below the average. So $288. I don't know. I haven't gone to an NBA game in years. I don't know if they have ticket specials and all. You know, baseball always has some kind of special going around for cheaper tickets. And mentioning COVID, I think of COVID, not only some people didn't want to go out because of COVID, but the other side of that is people found there's other things we can do. We learned we don't have to do all this stuff during COVID. We have other things that we enjoy doing. And so the going to a ball game, it may have lost some appeal just because, well, we found we can do all kinds of other stuff.
I think you're right,
The other thing that may
Dennis.
have hurt
Yeah.
baseball. Sorry, Mary, I didn't mean to.
No.
Yeah.
I was just agreeing with Dennis. Yeah.
The other
And
thing
it's
that may,
complicated because, there are some teams like the Brewers that really rely on attendance. But their attendance went down, but other teams, they don't care. They really don't care about the attendance that much because they're making money from real estate now. And so they rather have a bunch of fans paying over $100 to go to the game rather than have more fans paying less.
well, the
Mary,
other
You're
thing,
Minnesota, in which case you got the season tickets for $1 bleacher seat.
although
Mary, do you think if the Brewers had been playing better baseball, the attendance would have been there? Because really, second half of the season kind of collapsed, and they just weren't exciting to see, and the fan appeal dropped because of that.
Well, to touch on Randall's point, the Blue Jays actually had that at one time where you had a season ticket package, 81 games for $81.
Yep.
And you were the only restriction was you had to stay in the 500 level. And then they got rid of that, and the explanation was that it's not fair to the people who bought their tickets before that package was available, which is stupid. I figure anything that could get fans into the game is a good promotion.
Yeah, I got a friend that bought season tickets up in Minnesota for as long as there was. He lived up there. I'd go up there on a Friday and see 3 games for $3 with him.
The other thing that might have hurt baseball this year was from early December until mid-March, we didn't even know there was going to be a season. And people make their summer plans at that point. And people are saying, do we want to go to see Brewers games, not knowing that they're going to resolve the lockout? Oh, look, the resort at, correct me if the name's wrong, Oconomowoc Falls is running out of rooms.
Yeah.
I'm going to book that resort, and the hell with the Brewers.
No, you're
Yeah.
exactly right, Max. I was working front desk reception for the Brewers right before when the lockout was going on. And I had people calling me desperate to know what was going on because they wanted to make plans for traveling, to get together with family, for groups. You're exactly right.
So as far as I'm concerned, does Major League Baseball have a winning recipe? And in too many cities, the answer is no.
Speaking of yes, Padres beat the Phillies 8-5. I don't know if anybody was watching. I just saw that on my watch here. So
Even in Toronto, where the Blue Jays were drawing well, speaking from personal experience, I was not comfortable because of COVID going to a game if the roof was closed.
mhm.
I was not comfortable going to a game where I thought the crowd was going to be a sellout. And in fact, I know people who went to playoff games where every seat was occupied, where the roof was closed, and they came home with a souvenir that nobody wants, COVID. I know of that happening. It wasn't published in the papers. If it had been, you'd see even less people going.
Yeah. Well, any other questions for Max?
Yeah, I've got a question regarding expansion teams.
Yes.
Now, back in the 1950s, I was a Milwaukee Braves fan, and the Cubs, however, were always fighting for last place during the 1950s. And then in 1962, when it became possible for the Cubs to finish ninth, they did. And I thought that was rather unusual because usually the expansion teams will finish last or in the last two places. How unusual is it that that expansion teams don't finish last? And Mary, I'm trying to use the Cubs as an example in this case.
It happened more often than you realize that an expansion team didn't finish in last place. You're talking about 1962. The Mets, of course, finished in last place, but Houston finished in 8th.
Yep.
And so at that time, up until 1968, there was only one division. And if there were two expansion teams, only one could finish last, unless they tied for last place. Seattle Mariners did not finish in last place in their first season, thanks to our friend Charlie Finley, who in Oakland finished in last. Kansas City Royals, 1969. They didn't finish in last place. They didn't even finish in 5th place. They finished in 4th. Seattle was last, and the Chicago White Sox were in between. I think now with free agency and with teams willing to spend more money, you'll see expansion teams rise to the top more quickly than you used to. I mean, Miami Marlins won the World Series in only their 5th season. Arizona Diamondbacks won it in their 4th. And this is again when in 1998, George Will was asked on television, "What is your opinion of the state of the game?" And his answer was, "How healthy can the game be right now if a team that's never even played a game can win the World Series and the defending world champions can finish in last place?" And one of those two things did in fact happen in 1998, when the Marlins went from the World Series champions to 54 and 108.
And Max, if I thought I heard you right, the Marlins' first 2 winning seasons were the 2 years they went to the World Series.
Not only that, but the Marlins never lost a playoff series in their history until 2020.
Wow. That's an interesting trivia question.
You want to know the other thing the Marlins have never done? Finished in first place.
They're wild card both World Series.
They were the wild card both years.
Max,
Anybody else?
Phil.
Any other questions, comments?
Max, this is Phil. I just have a question about your presentation you did. I love the pictures you had on there, by the way. Those are really
Thank you.
cool.
Thank you.
But you had one on the Tomaso Garcia story is awesome too. But you had a picture on there when you were talking about the Angels, and it was Artie Moreno with an older player, it looked like, wearing an Angels jacket. I was just curious, who was that? Do you know?
I do, absolutely. It was Eli Gerba.
Ah, okay.
Eli Gerba, who was the first Angels player selected in the draft. And that picture was taken on opening day 2011, their 50th season, and he threw out the first pitch that year. Good
That
question.
was the season. They brought back an older player every game that year and had him sign autographs in center field. It was pretty cool. I went to a few of those.
That's right. One of those players, I believe, was Nolan Ryan.
Yeah, I wasn't out there for that one, but I did get to meet Rod Carew and Dave Winfield that way. That was pretty neat.
Were you living in Orange County at the time?
I was working out there for Amway for several years, and that season I was out there a lot. That's how I met Russ, who you know too.
Oh, Russell Hansen, of course.
Yep.
Well, that was the year the SABR convention went to Los Angeles, and I managed to get to 3 Angels games. And the 3 players who they brought out to throw out the first pitch and sign autographs that game. One was Fred Martinez, who pitched for them in the early 80s. Fred is a native Angelino, and they said what he was doing after he retired. He became a Los Angeles City firefighter. The second one was Tom Satriano, whose picture I've included in the slides. It was a picture of him and Dan Ardell with Roland Hemond. And Satriano became like Dennis and like myself, a CPA after he retired. And the third one was a pitcher who the Blue Jays got in a trade from the Angels in the early 90s, and that was Willie Fraser. I don't remember what they said he did. I just know he's lived in New York his whole life. And so those were the three guys. You do know that, speaking of the Ardells, you do know that Gene Ardell passed away recently.
Very sad. Yeah.
Yep.
One of my favorite writers, and I never met her, but I have friends who knew her and they were devastated by it. Yeah.
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 No, Perry Barber was devastated. She's
Yeah.
an umpire, and
Mhm.
who was the other one? I'm drawing a blank. I'm sorry, but Gene was actually my mentor. I had written a paper on Buck Rogers for the SABR Convention magazine in 2011, and she was my mentor on that. She was actually really important for this project. When Bill Allen and I were getting started, Gene and Bill and I sat down and they said, "You're going to learn from us. This is your first SABR book. We're going to explain to you what you need to do and when you need to do it." And I did learn a lot from both of them.
Say, Max, thinking about expansion drafts on both sides, is there any expansion draft year that sticks out as either haphazard or really well organized? Like maybe now it's a finely tuned machine, but kind of think back, is there any haphazard or well organized expansion drafts in your mind?
Oh, absolutely. The Angels and the Senators in 1960 were haphazard. Opening day for both teams was April of 1961. They didn't even have a team to speak of as recently as December of 1960. And in the Angels case, they didn't even have an owner. And so they had a rule that I think that you could only draft 4 players from a certain team, and a team could only lose 7 players to expansion. And so what happens? Washington drafts too many Orioles. So they have to trade Dean Chance to the Angels for, I think it was Joe Hicks, who they got from the Chicago White Sox, because they had drafted too many White Sox. And Andy McHugh had written an essay on that topic for the Los Angeles SABR Convention magazine, and we used it in our book. That was probably the worst, and the worst organized. I think they've gotten better as they've gone along. The last 2 expansion drafts allowed teams to select from both leagues. Before that, you could only select National League players if you were a National League team. You could only select American League players if you were an American League team, and yet you could select players from an independent team. And I'll give you an example of that. 1976, the Blue Jays, their manager, Roy Hartsfield, had come from the Hawaii Islanders. Half the roster was stacked of Padres farmhands, and the other half was independent players that were signed directly to the team in Hawaii. The Blue Jays could select players in the expansion draft who were under contract with Hawaii, but not under contract with San Diego. Rod Gaspar told me the story. He was playing for San Diego or for Hawaii in 1976, but under contract with San Diego. And years later, he asked Roy Hartsfield, "Why didn't you take me in the expansion draft?" And Hartsfield said, "I would have loved to. You would have been my starting center fielder, but I couldn't draft National League players."
The Seattle Pilots were kind of a mess, and that whole. But wasn't it a bad team? Because Kansas City was very well organized on the other side. So yeah.
Frank Collins is asking, were there any backroom agreements between an expansion team and a team loaded with good players like the Yankees that expansion would not select a big name unprotected player from that team? I can think of one example where this was the case. he was no longer a productive player, but in 1976, the Baltimore Orioles left Brooks Robinson unprotected. And the Mariners and the Blue Jays agreed not to select him and to allow him to finish his career in Baltimore. And same thing with the Boston Red Sox that year, Enrico Petrocelli. He had played for Seattle when they were a Red Sox farm team. Wouldn't have been something as a drawing card for him to go back to finish his career with Seattle. But again, he finished his career with Boston. He finished his career very soon after with Boston because he didn't make the team in 77. But yes, there have been instances where they agreed not to select certain players. There were other instances where teams let players go in the expansion draft because they had done something that wasn't baseball related to displease them. In 1968, they declared a national day of mourning when Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated, the day of his funeral. And disrespectfully, Major League Baseball left it to the teams to decide whether or not they were going to play. Houston and Pittsburgh were two teams that said, we want to play. Well, in Houston, there were three guys, Bob Aspromonte, Rusty Staub, and Dave Giusti, who said, no way, we're not playing. We want to respect the Kennedy family. Staub was traded to an expansion team, the Expos. Giusti was left unprotected and was drafted by an expansion team, the Padres. Aspromonte wasn't taken by either team, but they let him go to the Braves. Same situation in Pittsburgh. Maury Wills and Don Clendenin didn't want to play. Maury Wills and Don Clendenin were star players. They were playing for the Expos the next year. Anybody else?
Max, I want to thank you. I knew this was going to be good. I probably full disclosure. One of the reasons I wanted Max to do this is I really wanted to see it at the convention, but I got caught up in a conversation. And next thing I knew, I missed 3 presentations, including Max's. So I figured, well, one way to do this was to have Max come and do it here and share with people who don't get to go to the convention. So thank you, Max. I enjoyed that. Had
Well
you
done,
asked,
Max.
yeah.
Well done. Thanks a
Yeah.
lot.
So thank you. I'm going to end the recording now, and we can stay on afterwards if anybody would like to just chat.
All right.
Great
Thanks.
job, Max. Great job.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks
Thanks,
for
Max.
having me.
Great to see you.
Good to see you. Good to see you too. Hope to see everybody in Chicago.